The Case of the Vanishing Violin, Chapter 1, The Invitation. Late afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, bathing the parlor in a warmth that seemed to soften the edges of the world. Miss Marple sat in her favorite armchair, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. The rhythm of her knitting was as steady as her thoughts, which often wandered to the small dramas of village life, Mrs. Price's feud with the butcher, young Tommy's latest mischief, or the curious matter of the missing hymnals at St. Mary's Church. But today her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of the post. The postman, a cheerful young man named Billy, knocked briskly before slipping a single envelope through the slot. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and retrieved the letter, noting the elegant cream stationery and the precise looping handwriting. It was addressed to Miss J. Marple and bore a postmark from the nearby town of Much Benham. With a flicker of curiosity, she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter within. My dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you well. It has been far too long since we last corresponded, and I find myself thinking fondly of our days at the Women's Institute. My husband, Lord Harrow, and I are hosting a small gathering at Harrow Manor this coming weekend, and we would be delighted if you could join us. The occasion is the unveiling of a most extraordinary acquisition, a Stradivarius violin, one of the finest instruments ever crafted. We have engaged a talented young violinist to perform, and I believe you would enjoy the music and the company. Say you'll come. The manor is but an hour's train ride from St. Mary Mead, and we shall send a car to meet you at the station. I look forward to your reply. Yours sincerely, Beatrice Harrow. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sparkled with interest as she reread the letter. Lady Beatrice Harrow, née Beatrice Langley, had been a spirited young woman when they'd met years ago, full of charm and a touch of mischief. Her marriage to Lord Harrow, a wealthy but eccentric collector, had elevated her to the upper echelons of society, yet she retained a warmth that Miss Marple found endearing. The mention of a Stradivarius, however, piqued her curiosity most of all. Such instruments were not merely objects of beauty, but artifacts of history. Often surrounded by tales of intrigue and ambition, she rose from her chair, her movements deliberate, despite her age, and crossed to the small writing desk by the window. The desk was cluttered with stationery, a few pressed flowers, and a photograph of her nephew Raymond, now a successful writer in London. Dipping her pen in ink, she composed a brief reply, accepting the invitation with her characteristic courtesy. As she sealed the envelope, she felt a familiar stirring, a sense that this weekend might hold more than music and pleasant company. Miss Marple had a knack for sensing trouble, much as a gardener senses a storm before the first raindrop falls. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation. Miss Marple packed a modest suitcase, selecting her best woolen dresses and a warm shawl for the chilly evenings of early autumn. She entrusted her cottage to the care of her neighbor, Mrs. Clement, and arranged for the vicar to check on her prized roses. On the morning of her departure, she boarded the train at St. Mary Mead's tiny station, her suitcase at her side and her knitting bag slung over her arm. The journey to Much Benham was uneventful, the countryside rolling past in a patchwork of green fields and golden HEGEROs. At Much Benham station, a sleek black car awaited her, driven by a polite young man in a chauffeur's cap. Miss Marple? I'm James from Harrow Manor, he said, tipping his hat. Lady Harrow's expecting you. Miss Marple smiled and settled into the back seat, her eyes taking in the winding lanes and ancient oaks as they approached the manor. Harrow Manor loomed into view after 20 minutes, a grand Elizabethan pile of red brick and leaded windows, its chimneys piercing the sky like sentinels. Ivy clung to its walls, and the gravel drive crunched under the car's tires as they pulled up to the entrance. Lady Beatrice herself stood at the door, her silver hair swept into an elegant chignon, her dress a soft shade of lavender. "Jane." "My dear," she exclaimed, embracing Miss Marple warmly. "You haven't changed a bit. Come in, come in, the others are dying to meet you." Miss Marple stepped into the hall, her senses alert to the polished oak floors, the scent of beeswax, and the faint hum of anticipation that seemed to linger in the air. The weekend, she sensed, would be anything but ordinary Dot as Lady Beatrice. Led her to the drawing room, Miss Marple's mind catalogued the details, the heavy velvet curtains, the portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and the faint sound of a violin being tuned somewhere in the distance. She was introduced to Lord Harrow, a robust man with a booming laugh and a passion for collecting rarities. "Miss Marple, is it?" he said, shaking her hand vigorously. "Beatrice says you're a marvel with puzzles. Well, you'll have a treat this weekend. My Stradivarius is a puzzle in itself, a masterpiece of craftsmanship." The other guests soon joined them. Clara Wren, a young violinist with delicate features and a nervous smile. Dr. Ernest Quill, a music historian with wire-rimmed spectacles and a pedantic air. Mr. Felix Durant, an art dealer whose charm was as polished as his cufflinks. And Sophia Harrow, the Harrow's niece, a striking woman with sharp green eyes and a guarded demeanor. Each, Miss Marple noted, seemed to carry a private burden, their smiles masking secrets she was determined to unravel. That evening, as the group gathered for sherry, Lord Harrow unveiled the Stradivarius. It rested in a glass case in the music room, its amber varnish gleaming under the chandelier's light. Crafted in 1715, Lord Harrow declared, and played by virtuosos across Europe. A treasure, wouldn't you say? The guests murmured their agreement, but Miss Marple's eyes were on their faces Clara's awe, Quill's intensity, Felix's calculation, and Sophia's indifference. The violin, she realized, was more than a treasure. It was a catalyst, drawing out the hidden currents of human nature. Dot as the evening drew to a close. Miss Marple retired to her room, a cozy chamber with a four-poster bed and a view of the moonlit gardens. She sat by the window, her knitting needles idle in her lap, and considered the players in this unfolding drama. The Stradivarius was the centerpiece, but the real mystery, she suspected, lay in the hearts of those who coveted it. With a quiet smile, she resolved to watch and listen, for in the stillness of observation, truth often revealed itself. Chapter 2. Arrival at Harrow Manor. The crunch of gravel beneath the car's tires signaled Miss Marple's arrival at Harrow Manor, and as she stepped out into the crisp autumn air, she felt the weight of the estate's history settle around her. The manor was a magnificent structure, its red brick facade softened by centuries of wind and rain, its mullioned windows reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. Ivy trailed across the walls like delicate embroidery, and the air carried the scent of damp earth and fading roses. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl and followed James, the chauffeur, up the stone steps to the entrance, her suitcase in his hand and her knitting bag slung over her arm. Lady Beatrice greeted her with the warmth of an old friend, her lavender dress rustling as she ushered Miss Marple into the hall. "You must be tired after your journey," she said, her voice bright but tinged with the faintest trace of strain. "Let me show you the house before we join the others." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sweeping the hall's grandeur, the polished oak paneling, the chandelier dripping with crystal, and the grand staircase that curved upward like a promise of secrets. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects gazing down with expressions ranging from imperious to melancholic. Dot as they toured the ground floor. Lady Beatrice chattered about the manor's history. "Built in 1587, she said, and home to the Harrow family ever since. Charles, that's Lord Harrow, loves its quirks, the hidden passages and all." Miss Marple's ears pricked at the mention of hidden passages, but she merely smiled and asked about the gardens. Beatrice led her through the drawing room, where a fire crackled in the hearth, and the library, its shelves groaning with leather-bound volumes. The music room, however, was their final stop, and it was here that Miss Marple sensed the heart of the weekend's purpose. The music room was a haven of elegance, its walls adorned with pastoral murals and its windows overlooking a formal parterre. At its center stood a glass case, and within it the Stradivarius violin. The instrument was breathtaking, its curves catching the light like liquid amber, its strings taut with the promise of music. Charles's pride and joy, Beatrice said, her tone a mix of affection and exasperation. He's spent a fortune securing it, and now he wants to show it off. Miss Marple stepped closer, noting the case's sturdy lock and the small brass keyhole. A beautiful piece, she murmured, but her mind was already turning over the possibilities. Beauty, she knew, often attracted envy. Lord Harrow joined them, his presence filling the room like a gust of wind. Miss Marple, he boomed, his mustache twitching with enthusiasm. What do you think of my treasure? He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered and ruddy-cheeked, with a penchant for tweed and a voice that carried. Miss Marple complimented the violin, and he launched into a monologue about its provenance, crafted by Antonio Stradivari in Cremona, owned by a French duke, lost during the Revolution and rediscovered in a Viennese attic. His passion was infectious, but Miss Marple noticed Beatrice's subtle sigh, as if the violin were a rival for her husband's affection. The other guests began to arrive, drawn by the promise of sherry and conversation. Clara Wren was the first, a slight young woman with chestnut hair and eyes that darted like a bird's. She wore a simple green dress, and her hands fidgeted as she introduced herself. "I'm to play the Stradivarius tomorrow," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It's an honor." Miss Marple smiled kindly, noting the girl's nervousness and the faint calluses on her fingers. The mark of a dedicated musician. Dr. Ernest Quill followed, a thin man with a scholar's stoop, and a pair of spectacles perched precariously on his nose. His suit was impeccably tailored but slightly worn, and his handshake was firm but brief. "A pleasure, Miss Marple," he said, his voice precise. "I've come to study the violin's history." It's said to have been played by Vivaldi himself. His eyes gleamed with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and Miss Marple filed this away for later consideration. Mr. Felix Durant entered next, his charm as smooth as the silk scarf tucked into his jacket. He was in his early 40s, with dark hair slicked back and a smile that suggested he knew more than he let on. "Miss Marple, a delight," he said, bowing slightly. "I deal in art, but a Stradivarius is a work of art in its own right, don't you think?" His flattery was practiced, but Miss Marple's answering smile was bland, her instincts warning her of a man who played angles. Finally, Sophia Harrow appeared, her entrance quiet but commanding. She was in her late 20s, with auburn hair, pinned loosely in a dress of deep emerald that accentuated her sharp green eyes. "Aunt Beatrice mentioned you," she said to Miss Marple, her tone polite but cool. "You're fond of knitting, I hear?" There was a hint of amusement in her voice, as if knitting were a quaint pastime, but Miss Marple met her gaze steadily, sensing a mind as quick as her own. Dinner was served in the dining room, a cavernous space with a table set for 8. The meal was exquisite roast pheasant, glazed carrots, and a pear tart that melted on the tongue, but Miss Marple paid more attention to the conversation than the food. Lord Harrow dominated, regaling them with tales of his collecting adventures, while Beatrice steered the talk toward lighter topics. Clara spoke little, her eyes often on her plate, while Dr. Quill interjected with facts about 18th century luthiers. Felix and Sophia exchanged barbed pleasantries, their words laced with an undercurrent of tension Miss Marple couldn't quite place. As the evening wound down, Lord Harrow led the group back to the music room for a final look at the Stradivarius. He turned the key in the case's lock with a flourish, allowing Clara to lift the violin briefly. Her fingers trembled as she touched the strings, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of something fear, perhaps, or longing in her eyes. The violin was returned, the case locked, and Lord Harrow pocketed the key. "Safe and sound," he said, patting his waistcoat. But Miss Marple, watching the guests' faces, felt a prickle of unease. Safe, perhaps, but for how long? She retired to her room, her mind buzzing with impressions. The Stradivarius was a magnet, drawing out greed, envy, and ambition. As she sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, she began to sort the players in this unfolding drama. Clara, fragile but determined. Quill, scholarly but intense. Felix, charming but slippery. Sophia, clever but guarded. And the Harrows themselves, Beatrice, anxious beneath her poise, and Charles, oblivious to the currents swirling around his prize. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she gazed at the moonlit gardens below. The weekend had only begun, but already she sensed the shadow of a mystery. Chapter 3. The performances following evening, Harrow Manor hummed with anticipation. The music room had been transformed for Clara Wren's performance, its chairs arranged in a semicircle facing a small platform where the Stradivarius would sing. Candles flickered in silver sconces, casting a warm glow over the murals of frolicking nymphs, and the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and expectation. Miss Marple, dressed in a soft gray dress with a lace collar, took her seat near the back, her knitting bag at her feet. From this vantage point, she could observe the guests without drawing attention, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Lady Beatrice, resplendent in a sapphire gown, welcomed the group with a practiced smile. "Tonight," she said, "we celebrate not only the Stradivarius, but the talent of Miss Clara Wren, who will bring it to life." Her words were gracious, but Miss Marple noted the tightness around her eyes, as if she sensed the evening's weight. Lord Harrow stood beside her, his face alight with pride, the key to the violin's case dangling from a chain at his waist. The other guests settled into their seats, Dr. Quill, his notebook open on his lap. Felix Durrant, his smile fixed, but his fingers tapping restlessly. And Sophia Harrow, her expression unreadable as she smoothed her crimson dress. Clara Wren entered. Last, her green dress replaced by a simple black gown that made her seem both younger and more solemn. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, but Miss Marple saw the tremor in her hands as she approached the glass case. Lord Harrow unlocked it with a flourish, lifting the Stradivarius and placing it in Clara's hands. The room fell silent, the only sound the soft creak of the case's hinges. Clara cradled the violin, her eyes closing briefly as if in prayer, then raised it to her chin. The first notes were tentative, a delicate thread of sound that seemed to test the room's acoustics. Then, as Clara gained confidence, the music swelled, filling the space with a richness that was almost tangible. She played Vivaldi's Spring from the Four Seasons, the notes dancing like sunlight on water. Miss Marple, though no expert in music, felt the power of the performance, the way it seemed to draw the listeners into a shared dream. But her eyes were not on Clara alone. They roamed the audience, cataloging every reaction. Dr. Quill leaned forward, his pen scratching furiously in his notebook, his lips moving as if reciting facts to himself. Felix Durrant sat back, his smile replaced by a look of calculation, his fingers still as he watched Clara's bow. Sophia Harrow's gaze was fixed not on the violinist, but on her uncle, her eyes narrowing slightly when he patted the key at his waist. Lady Beatrice clasped her hands tightly, her smile frozen, while Lord Harrow beamed, oblivious to the undercurrents. Miss Marple's needles lay idle in her lap, her mind as sharp as the music's highest notes. As Clara transitioned to A slower, more mournful pizza baciadagio, the atmosphere shifted. The music seemed to peel back the guests' facades, revealing glimpses of their true selves. Clara's face was transformed, her nervousness replaced by a fierce concentration, as if the violin were an extension of her soul. Miss Marple wondered about the girl's past, the accusation of theft Beatrice had mentioned in passing. Could such a talent harbor a thief's heart? It seemed unlikely, yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. The performance ended with a flourish, Clara's final note lingering like a sigh. The room erupted in applause, Lord Harrow clapping loudest of all. Clara bowed, her cheeks flushed, and returned the Stradivarius to its case. Lord Harrow locked it with a satisfied nod, slipping the key back into his waistcoat. "Magnificent," he declared. "A night to remember." The guests murmured their agreement, but Miss Marple caught the fleeting glances exchanged between Felix and Sophia, the way Dr. Quill's eyes lingered on the case, and the slight tremble in Clara's. Hands as she stepped off the platform. Supper followed, a light affair of cold meats and fruit in the dining room. The conversation buzzed with praise for Clara, but Miss Marple steered it gently, asking innocuous questions that revealed more than the speakers intended. She learned that Dr. Quill had spent months researching the Stradivarius, even visiting Cremona to study Stradivari's methods. "The varnish," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "is a mystery in itself. Some say it's the key to the sound." His passion was genuine, but Miss Marple wondered if it bordered on mania. Felix, meanwhile, spoke of the art market, hinting at the astronomical sums rare instruments could fetch. "A Stradivarius sold for millions last year," he said, his eyes flicking to Lord Harrow. "Yours must be worth a fortune." Lord Harrow laughed, but Beatrice's smile faltered, and Miss Marple noted Sophia's sudden stillness. Clara, seated at the far end of the table, ate little, her eyes darting to the door as if she longed to escape Dot as the evening drew to a close. Miss Marple lingered in the music room, ostensibly to admire the murals. The Stradivarius gleamed in, its case a silent sentinel. She examined the lock, noting its sturdy construction and the windows, all bolted shut. The room felt secure, yet she couldn't shake the sense that something was amiss. Returning to her room, she sat by the fire, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The performance had been a triumph, but it had also been a stage, and the players, she suspected, were already plotting their next moves. Chapter 4. The vanishing morning dawned gray and heavy, the sky over Harrow Manor bruised with clouds that promised rain. Miss Marple awoke early, her internal clock as precise as ever, and dressed in a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan. She descended to the dining room, expecting a quiet breakfast, but was met instead by a scene of chaos. Lady Beatrice stood in the hall, her face pale, her hands wringing a lace handkerchief. Lord Harrow's voice boomed from the music room, a mix of anger and disbelief. "It's gone. The blasted thing is gone." Miss Marple hurried to the music room, where Lord Harrow stood before the glass case, his face red with fury. The case was intact, its lock undisturbed, but the Stradivarius had vanished. The velvet lining where the violin had rested was empty, a stark reminder of the theft. The other guests gathered, drawn by the commotion. Clara, her eyes wide with shock. Dr. Quill, clutching his notebook as if it could shield him. Felix, his charm replaced by a wary frown. And Sophia, her expression unreadable but her posture tense. "What happened?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm amid the storm. Lord Harrow turned to her, his hands gesturing wildly. "The violin, it was here last night, locked up tight. I checked it myself before bed, and now it's gone, without a trace." Beatrice, hovering at his side, added, "The case hasn't been tampered with, Jane. It's impossible." But Miss Marple knew that nothing was impossible, only improbable. and she stepped closer to examine the scene. The glass case was pristine, its surface free of scratches or smudges. The lock, a sturdy brass mechanism, showed no signs of picking. The key, Lord Harrow confirmed, had remained in his possession, tucked into his waistcoat pocket. "I slept with it under my pillow," he said, his voice hoarse. "No one could have taken it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the room. The windows were bolted, the door had been locked overnight, and the only key to the room was with the butler, who swore he hadn't opened it. Beatrice suggested calling the police, her voice trembling. "We must report this at once." "A Stradivarius, it's priceless." But Miss Marple raised a hand, her tone gentle but firm. "Might I suggest we investigate quietly first? The thief is likely still among us, and a police presence might drive them to act rashly." Lord Harrow hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, Miss Marple. You've a reputation for sorting things out. What do you need?" "Time," she replied, "and access to everyone's accounts of last night." She began by questioning the household, starting with the staff. The butler, a dour man named Mr. Grayson, confirmed that the music room had been locked at midnight after the guests retired. The maids and footmen reported no unusual activity, though one young maid, Elsie, mentioned hearing footsteps in the corridor around 2 in the morning. "I thought it was just the wind," she said, twisting her apron. Miss Marple thanked her, filing the detail away. Next, she spoke to the guests. Beginning with Clara Wren, the young violinist was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I was in my room all night," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't sleep after the performance. It was so overwhelming, but I didn't leave." Miss Marple noted her sincerity, but also her fear, as if she expected to be blamed. "You played beautifully," Miss Marple said, softening her tone. "Did you notice anything unusual about the violin or the case?" Clara shook her head, but her eyes flickered, and Miss Marple sensed she was holding something back. Dr. Quill was next, his manner defensive. "I'm a scholar, not a thief," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "I was in my room, writing notes on the Stradivariuses. History." He showed her his notebook, filled with dense handwriting and diagrams of violin construction. Miss Marple complimented his thoroughness, but her eyes lingered on his ink-stained fingers, wondering if they'd held more than a pen last night. Felix. Durant met her questions with a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I slept like a log," he said, spreading his hands. "This is a tragedy, of course, but I've no idea how it happened." His nonchalance was practiced, but Miss Marple caught the slight tension in his jaw, as if he were weighing his words. Sophia Harrow, by contrast, was direct, her green eyes meeting Miss Marple's without flinching. "I was in my room reading," she said. "I'd no interest in Uncle's violin. It's just another of his obsessions." Her candor was refreshing, but Miss Marple sensed a deeper resentment beneath it. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple returned to the music room, her mind sifting through the clues. The locked case, the bolted windows, the absent violin. It was a puzzle worthy of her skills. She examined the floor, the walls, the ceiling, searching for anything out of place. A faint scuff mark near the bookshelf caught her eye, but it was too vague to be conclusive. Still, she felt the stirrings of a theory, one that would require patience to prove. Lunch was a tense affair, the guests eating in mere silence. Lord Harrow's anger had given way to despair, and Beatrice's attempts at conversation fell flat. Miss Marple observed them all, her mind working like her knitting needles, stitching together fragments of truth. The Stradivarius was gone, but it hadn't vanished into thin air. Someone had taken it, and that someone was close, perhaps closer than anyone realized. Chapter 5. The locked room. Afternoon. The rain had arrived. A steady drizzle that cloaked Harrow Manor in a silvery mist. Miss Marple stood in the music room, her umbrella propped in a corner, her eyes tracing the contours of the glass case. The mystery of the Stradivarius's disappearance was, at its core, a locked room puzzle, one of her favorite kinds. The case was intact, the lock unviolated, the room sealed. Yet the violin was gone. To solve it, she would need to think not only logically but imaginatively. For human nature, she knew, was rarely as straightforward as a blueprint. She began by reconstructing the events of the previous night. After Clara's performance, the Stradivarius had been returned to its case, locked by Lord Harrow himself. The guests had lingered briefly, then dispersed to their rooms. The music room had been locked by Mr. Grayson, the butler, at midnight, and Lord Harrow had kept the case's key on his person. The room's only door and windows were secure, and no one had reported seeing or hearing anything unusual. Except Elsie. The maid, with her tail of footsteps, Miss Marple circled the room, her steps measured, her eyes alert for anomalies. The windows, tall and narrow, were bolted from the inside, their latches rusted with age. She tested each one, confirming they hadn't been opened in years. The door, heavy oak with a mortise lock, showed no signs of tampering. The floor, polished to a mirror shine, bore no obvious marks, though she noted the faint scuff near the bookshelf again. The ceiling, adorned with plasterwork roses, was intact. Ruling out access from above, the glass case itself was her next focus. It stood on a mahogany pedestal, its panels thick and unblemished. The lock was a modern design requiring a specific key that Lord Harrow had shown her, a small, ornate brass key now safely in his possession. She peered inside, noting the velvet lining and the slight indentation where the violin had rested. There were no hidden compartments, no trick panels. The case was as secure as it appeared. Frustrated but undeterred, Miss Marple turned her attention to the room's furnishings. The bookshelf, filled with leather-bound volumes on music and history, seemed ordinary, but she recalled Lady Beatrice's mention of hidden passages. She ran her fingers along the shelves, pressing gently until a faint click rewarded her efforts. A section of the bookcase swung inward, revealing a narrow passage cloaked in shadow. Her heart quickened, but she kept her expression serene, aware that someone might be watching. The passage was dusty, its walls rough stone, and it smelled of mildew and time. Miss Marple stepped inside, using her handkerchief to shield her nose. The floor bore faint footprints, too indistinct to identify, but recent enough to suggest use. The passage led to a staircase that descended to the servants' quarters, emerging behind a panel in the butler's pantry. It was a clever design, likely used by past Harrows to move unseen, and it explained how someone could have entered the music room without using the door. Returning to the music room, Miss Marple closed the passage and considered her next move. The hidden route was a breakthrough, but it didn't solve the locked case. She needed to understand the thief's method and motive. To that end, she resumed her interviews, starting with Lord Harrow. He was in the library, nursing a brandy, his earlier bluster replaced by gloom. "I failed it, Miss Marple," he said. "That violin was my legacy." She listened sympathetically, asking about the key's movements. "Never left my side," he insisted, showing her the key. "I even checked the case at 11, and the violin was there." Beatrice was next, her anxiety palpable. "Charles is devastated," she said, twisting her handkerchief. "And I feel so helpless. Who could do this?" Miss Marple asked about the guests, probing gently. Beatrice hesitated, then mentioned Clara's past accusation of theft. It was years ago, and she was cleared, but still. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the prejudice but reserving judgment. The afternoon passed in a blur of questions and observations. Miss Marple spoke again with Clara, who seemed on the verge of tears. "I didn't take it," she said, her voice breaking. "Why would I ruin my career?" Miss Marple believed her sincerity but pressed for details about the performance. Clara admitted to noticing Dr. Quill's intense scrutiny of the violin, as if he were memorizing its every detail. Dr. Quill, when questioned, was indignant. "I'm here to study, not steal," he said, but his eyes darted to the side, and Miss Marple sensed his unease. Felix Durant, by contrast, was all charm, offering theories about professional thieves and black market rings. "Happens all the time in my trade," he said, but his casualness felt forced. Sophia Harrow remained aloof, claiming ignorance of the manor's passages, but admitting to exploring the house as a child. "It's full of secrets," she said, her smile enigmatic. By evening, Miss Marple's mind was a tapestry of clues and contradictions. The hidden passage was key, but the locked case remained a riddle. As she joined the guests for dinner, she watched their interactions, noting Felix's whispered exchange with Sophia, Clara's isolation, and Quill's nervous fidgeting. The thief, she was certain, was in this room, their mask of innocence, as carefully crafted as the Stradivarius itself. Her task was to find the flaw in their design, and she would, in time. Chapter 6. Clara's secret reign continued into the next morning, turning the manor's gardens into a sodden maze of green and gray. Miss Marple, undeterred by the weather, took her breakfast in the morning room, a cheerful space with yellow walls and a view of the rose garden. She sipped her tea, her eyes on Clara Wren, who sat alone at the far end of the table, picking at a piece of toast. The young violinist's pallor and the shadows under her eyes spoke of a sleepless night, and Miss Marple resolved to uncover the source of her distress. After breakfast, she found Clara in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and orchids. The girl was staring at a blooming jasmine, her hands clasped tightly. "May I join you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle. Clara started, then nodded, her smile fragile. They sat on a wicker bench, the patter of rain a soft counterpoint to their conversation. Miss Marple began with pleasantries, complimenting Clara's performance, but soon steered the talk to the violin's theft. "I didn't take it," Clara said at once, her voice fierce. "I know what people think because of that old accusation, but I'm innocent." Miss Marple nodded, her expression encouraging. "Tell me about that accusation," she said, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. Clara hesitated, then poured out her story. 3 years ago, while studying at a conservatory, she'd been accused of stealing rare sheet music from the library. "It was a mistake," she said. "The music was found in another student's bag, but the suspicion stuck. I've worked so hard to rebuild my reputation, and now this." Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Clara's story rang true, but there was more to it, she sensed. "Did you notice anything unusual last night?" she asked. Clara bit her lip, then admitted to seeing Dr. Quill lingering near the case after the performance. "He was touching the glass, almost stroking it," she said. "It was odd." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind turning to Quill's obsession with the Stradivarius. Their conversation was interrupted by Sophia Harrow, who entered the conservatory with a cool smile. "Am I intruding?" she asked, her tone suggesting she didn't care if she was. Clara excused herself, and Sophia took her place, her emerald dress a vivid contrast to the greenery. "You're quite the detective, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes sharp. "What do you make of our little mystery?" Miss Marple smiled blandly, deflecting with a question about the manor's history. Sophia obliged, but her answers were vague, and Miss Marple sensed she was being watched as closely as she was watching. Later, Miss Marple sought out Lord Harrow, finding him in his study, surrounded by ledgers and artifacts. She asked about Clara's hiring, learning that Beatrice had chosen her based on a recommendation from a London music school. She's talented, Harrow said, but Beatrice mentioned that old theft business. Makes one wonder. Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the prejudice but focusing on the violin's security. She asked to see the key again, examining its intricate design. One of a kind, Harrow said proudly. Made specially for the case. The day passed in a series of quiet inquiries. Miss Marple spoke with the staff, learning that Clara had been seen pacing the corridor late at night, though no one could confirm her movements. Dr. Quill, when questioned again, denied touching the case, but admitted to studying it closely. I was noting its condition, he said, his tone defensive. Felix Durrant, meanwhile, offered to help Miss Marple investigate, his charm masking a keen interest in her progress. You're wasted in that village, Miss Marple, he said, but she deflected his flattery with a smile. By evening, Miss Marple's suspicions about Clara had softened, but she remained cautious. The girl's fear was genuine, but fear could stem from guilt as easily as innocence. The clue about Quill was intriguing, and she resolved to watch him closely. As she joined the guests for dinner, she noted Clara's absence, learning from Beatrice that the girl had pleaded a headache. The meal was strained, the theft hanging over them like the rain clouds outside. Miss Marple ate sparingly, her mind weaving together the threads of Clara's story, Quill's obsession, and the locked case. The truth, she knew, was close, but it would require patience to unravel. Chapter 7. The historian's obsession, third day at Harrow Manor, dawned with a break in the rain. The sky a pale wash of blue that lifted the household spirits, if only slightly. Miss Marple, dressed in a navy dress with a pearl brooch, took her morning walk in the gardens, her umbrella doubling as a walking stick. The roses were heavy with dew, and the air was fresh, but her thoughts were on Dr. Ernest Quill, whose intensity had begun to dominate her suspicions. She found him in the library after breakfast, poring over a stack of books on violin craftsmanship. His spectacles glinted in the morning light, and his fingers were stained with ink, a testament to his tireless note-taking. "Good morning, Dr. Quill," Miss Marple said, settling into a nearby armchair with her knitting. "I see you're deep in your research." Quill looked up, startled, then smiled thinly. "Yes, Miss Marple. The Stradivarius is a marvel, and its loss is a tragedy for scholarship." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking as she probed gently. "You mentioned its provenance yesterday, played by Vivaldi, I believe?" Quill's eyes lit up, and he launched into a lecture about the violin's history, tracing its journey from Cremona to Paris to Vienna. "It's not just an instrument," he said, his voice fervent. "It's a piece of history, a link to the past." Miss Marple listened, noting his passion but also his possessiveness. As if the violin were his by right, she steered the conversation to the manor, asking about its layout. "Lady Beatrice mentioned hidden passages," she said casually. "Quill's." Expression flickered, but he nodded. "Oh, yes, I've studied the manor's plans. It's riddled with them servants' roots, mostly from the 17th century. His knowledge was impressive, and Miss Marple wondered if it extended to the passage she'd found. She asked about his movements on the night of the theft, and he repeated his alibi writing in his room, but his fingers tightened on his pen. A small towel she didn't miss. Later, Miss Marple sought out Beatrice, finding her in the drawing room, arranging flowers. "Dr. Quill seems devoted to the violin," she said, helping with a vase. Beatrice sighed. "Too devoted, if you ask me. Charles invited him because of his expertise, but he's been poking around the house, asking odd questions." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting Quill's curiosity as a potential clue. She spent the afternoon exploring the manor, revisiting the hidden passage. The footprints were still there, and she found a tiny thread of gray wool caught on a splinter, possibly from a coat or scarf. It was a small find, but it suggested the passage had been used recently, perhaps by Quill. She returned to the music room, examining the bookshelf again, and noticed a faint scratch on the floor. As if it had been moved repeatedly. At tea, Miss Marple observed Quill closely. He was quieter than usual, his eyes darting to Lord Harrow, who was lamenting the violin's loss. Felix tried to lighten the mood with a story about a stolen painting, but Quill snapped at him, his temper flaring. "This isn't some trinket," he said. "It's irreplaceable." The outburst drew stares, and Miss Marple saw Clara flinch. Her teacup rattling in its saucer. By evening, Miss Marple's suspicions about Quill had deepened. His knowledge of the manor, his obsession with the violin, and his nervous demeanor all pointed to involvement. But the locked case remained a hurdle. How had he bypassed it? She considered the possibility of a duplicate key or a lock-picking skill, but both seemed unlikely without evidence. As she retired to her room, her knitting needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over Quill's words and actions. He was a scholar, yes, but scholars, she knew, could be as driven by passion as any thief. Chapter 8. Felix's gambit, fourth day at Harrow Manor, brought a restless energy, as if the house itself were impatient for the mystery's resolution. Miss Marple, dressed in a soft green dress, spent the morning in the library, ostensibly reading but actually watching Felix Durant. The art dealer had been a puzzle from the start, his charm a polished veneer over something sharper. His whispered exchange with Sophia at dinner had lingered in her mind, and she was determined to uncover his role in the theft. She found her chance after lunch, when Felix approached her in the hall, his smile as bright as ever. "Miss Marple, you're the talk of the house," he said, leaning against a suit of armor. "Any progress on our violin mystery?" His tone was light, but his eyes were keen, and Miss Marple sensed he was fishing for information. She smiled, blandly deflecting with a comment about the weather, but invited him to walk with her in the gardens. As they strolled along the gravel paths, the air crisp with the scent of wet grass, Miss Marple probed gently. "You mentioned the art market, Mr. Durant. Do violins like the Stradivarius often change hands?" Felix nodded, his hands in his pockets. "Oh, yes. They're rare, so they fetch a premium, especially on the black market." He spoke casually, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of interest in his eyes. As if he were testing her reaction, she steered the conversation to the night of the theft, asking about his movements. "I was in my room reading," he said, his smile unwavering. "Nothing exciting, I'm afraid." But Miss Marple had overheard him arguing with Sophia that night, and she decided to take a risk. "I couldn't help but notice you and Miss Harrow seemed preoccupied at dinner," she said, her tone mild. Felix's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Just a friendly disagreement," he said. "Sophia's got a sharp tongue." Miss Marple let the matter drop, but her suspicions grew. She sought out Sophia next, finding her in the drawing room, sketching a vase of roses. "Mr. Durant mentioned you had a disagreement," Miss Marple said, settling beside her. Sophia's pencil paused, and her eyes narrowed. "Felix talks too much," she said. "It was nothing, just business." But her tone was guarded, and Miss Marple sensed a deeper connection between them. Later, she spoke with Beatrice, who revealed that Felix had approached Lord Harrow about selling some of his artifacts. "Charles refused," Beatrice said. "He doesn't trust Felix, says he's too slick." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting Felix's financial motives. She returned to the music room, re-examining the case and the passage, searching for any clue that might tie Felix to the theft. A faint smudge on the bookshelf caught her eye, possibly a fingerprint, but it was too vague to be useful. At dinner, Miss Marple watched Felix closely, noting his attempts to charm Clara, who rebuffed him politely. Quill was subdued, his eyes on his plate, while Sophia and Felix avoided each other's gaze. Lord Harrow, still mourning the violin, spoke little, and Beatrice's efforts to keep the conversation alive were strained. Miss Marple ate sparingly, her mind piecing together Felix's charm, his argument with Sophia, and his interest in the black market. He was a player in this game, she was certain, but his exact role remained elusive. Chapter 9. Sophia's motive at fifth day at Harrow Manor was marked by a return of the rain, a soft patter that seemed to mirror the household's growing tension. Miss Marple, dressed in a plum-colored dress, spent the morning in her room, her knitting needles clicking as she reviewed her mental notes, for she rarely wrote anything down, trusting her memory to hold the threads of the mystery. Sophia Harrow, with her sharp eyes and guarded demeanor, had emerged as a key figure, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover her motives. She found Sophia in the billiard room, practicing shots with a cool precision. The green baize table was a stark contrast to her crimson dress, and her movements were as calculated as her words. "Miss Marple," she said, not looking up, "come to interrogate me?" Her tone was teasing, but there was an edge to it, and Miss Marple smiled, unfazed. "Merely to chat," she said, settling into a chair. "You seem very at home here." Sophia sank a ball, then leaned on her cue. "I grew up in this house," she said. "It's full of memories, some good, some not." Miss Marple nodded, asking about her childhood. Sophia spoke of summers exploring the manor, her closeness to Beatrice, and her strained relationship with Lord Harrow. "He's generous but controlling," she said. "He holds my inheritance like a leash." Her bitterness was palpable, and Miss Marple saw a motive taking shape. She probed further, asking about Sophia's finances. "I manage," Sophia said, her eyes narrowing. "But Uncle's rules make it difficult. He thinks I'm frivolous, but I have plans, investments, projects." Miss Marple noted her ambition, wondering if the Stradivarius's value had tempted her. She asked about the night of the theft, and Sophia repeated her alibi reading in her room, but her fingers tightened on the cue, a small sign of nerves. Later, Miss Marple spoke with Beatrice, who confirmed Sophia's financial troubles. "She's been asking Charles for money," Beatrice said, her voice low. "He refused, saying she needs to prove herself. It's caused tension." Miss Marple nodded, her mind linking Sophia's resentment to the theft. She returned to the music room, examining the passage again, and found a tiny pearl button near the entrance, possibly from a woman's blouse. It was a slender clue, but it pointed to Sophia's presence down at tea. Miss Marple observed Sophia's interactions, noting her coolness toward Felix and her deference to Beatrice. Clara was absent, still unwell, and Quill's silence was heavy, as if he carried a secret. Lord Harrow spoke of hiring a private detective, but Miss Marple persuaded him to wait, sensing the truth was close. As she retired to her room, her knitting resumed, her mind weaving Sophia's motive, financial need, and familial resentment into the larger tapestry. She was a suspect, yes, but the locked case remained a puzzle, and Miss Marple needed more to be certain. Chapter 10. The Hidden Passage of Sixth Day at Harrow Manor brought a crisp clarity to the air, the rain giving way to a pale sun that illuminated the estate's every detail. Miss Marple, dressed in a tweed suit, felt a renewed sense of purpose. As she revisited the hidden passage, the discovery of the passage had been a turning point, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Who had used it, and how had they bypassed the locked case? She was determined to find out. She entered the music room early, before the household stirred, and opened the passage behind the bookshelf. The air was musty, and the faint footprints were still visible, joined now by her own. She followed the passage to its end, emerging in the butler's pantry, where a panel slid aside with a soft creak. The pantry was empty, but she noted a faint smudge of dust on the floor, suggesting recent movement. Returning to the passage, she examined the walls. finding a small notch where a tool might have been wedged, a pry bar, perhaps, or a knife. Marple spent the morning questioning the staff, focusing on their access to the passage. Mr. Grayson, the butler, admitted to knowing of it but swore he hadn't used it in years. "It's for emergencies," he said, his tone stiff. Elsie, the maid, was more forthcoming, mentioning that she'd seen Sophia near the pantry late one night. She said she was looking for tea, Elsie said, but her eyes were doubtful. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind noting Sophia's presence. As a clue dot, she sought out Lord Harrow next, asking about the passage's history. "Oh, it's an old trick," he said, chuckling despite his gloom. "My ancestors used it to eavesdrop or escape creditors. I showed it to Sophia when she was a girl. She loved it." Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions about Sophia deepening. She asked about the case's lock again, learning that it was custom-made by a London locksmith with only one key. "No duplicates?" Harrow insisted, showing her the key. "I had it checked." The afternoon was spent observing the guests. Clara had returned, her face pale but composed, and she avoided Quill, who seemed increasingly withdrawn. Felix was his usual charming self, but Miss Marple caught him glancing at the music room, as if drawn to it. Sophia was elusive, slipping away when Miss Marple approached. At tea, Miss Marple steered the conversation to the manor's quirks, hoping to draw out more about the passage. Quill mentioned studying its plans, confirming his knowledge, while Sophia claimed ignorance. Her smile too quick dot by evening, Miss Marple's theory was taking shape. The passage had been used to access the music room, but the locked case required another explanation, perhaps a trick or a tool. She returned to the passage one last time, finding a tiny splinter of wood near the entrance, possibly from the case itself. It was a small clue, but it suggested the thief had been careless. As she joined the guests for dinner, her mind was alight with possibilities, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome. The passage was the key, but the lock was the heart of the mystery, and she was closer than ever to unlocking it. Chapter 11. A second theft. Seventh day at Harrow Manor brought an unexpected twist, one that deepened the mystery and sharpened Miss Marple's focus. She was in the library, reviewing her mental notes, when Lord Harrow burst in, his face ashen. "It's happened again," he cried, "a manuscript gone from my collection." The room fell silent, the guests exchanging wary glances. Miss Marple set aside her knitting, her mind already racing. A second theft suggested a pattern, and patterns, she knew, were the key to unraveling human behavior. The missing item was a rare music manuscript, a 17th century score attributed to Claudio Monteverdi, kept in a locked cabinet in Lord Harrow's study. Unlike the Stradivarius, it was not priceless, but its historical value was significant. Miss Marple accompanied Harrow to the study, where the cabinet stood open, its lock intact, but the manuscript gone. "I checked it yesterday," Harrow said, his voice trembling. "It was there." Miss Marple examined the lock, noting its similarity to the violin case's accustomed design. With a key Harrow kept in his desk, she questioned the household, starting with Beatrice, who was near tears. "First the violin, now this," she said. "What's next?" Miss Marple asked about the manuscript's value, learning it was worth a modest sum but prized by collectors like Dr. Quill. She spoke to Quill next, finding him in the library, his face pale. "A Monteverdi score," he said, his voice shaking. "It's a loss to musicology." But his eyes were too bright, and Miss Marple sensed his interest was more than academic. Clara was distraught, fearing the thefts would taint her reputation further. "I didn't touch it," she said, her hands trembling. Miss Marple reassured her, asking about the study's visitors. Clara mentioned seeing Felix there the previous day, looking at the artifacts. Felix, when questioned, admitted to browsing the study, but denied touching the cabinet. "I'm an art dealer, not a music thief," he said, his smile strained. Sophia, as usual, was evasive, claiming she rarely visited the study. "Uncle's collections don't interest me," she said, but her eyes avoided Miss Marple's. Miss Marple returned to the study, examining the cabinet and the desk where the key was kept. The lock showed no signs of tampering, and the key was still in its drawer, suggesting the thief had access to it. She considered the passage again, wondering if it connected to the study, but a thorough search revealed no such route. The manuscript's theft, she realized, was a distraction, meant to muddy the waters or serve a secondary purpose. At dinner, the atmosphere was funereal, the guests eating in near silence. Miss Marple steered the conversation to the manuscript, watching for reactions. Quill's knowledge of Monteverdi was encyclopedic, but his nervousness was palpable. Felix made a joke about cursed collections, but his eyes darted to Sophia, who ignored him. Clara ate little, her gaze fixed on her plate, while Beatrice tried to rally the group with talk of the gardens. Lord Harrow was silent, his despair a heavy presence. As she retired to her room, Miss Marple's mind was alight with connections. The manuscript's theft suggested a thief with access to the manor's inner workings, someone who knew its secrets and its locks. Quill, Felix, and Sophia remained her primary suspects, but the locked case and cabinet pointed to a skill or tool she hadn't yet identified. Her knitting needles clicked softly, her thoughts weaving a net that was tightening around the truth. Chapter 12. The Trappy the Eighth Day. Miss Marple felt the mystery nearing its climax. The thefts had created a web of suspicion, and she was ready to test her theories. She proposed a plan to Lord Harrow, who was desperate for resolution. "Announce that you found a clue to the violin's whereabouts," she said, her voice low. "Say it will be revealed at dinner tonight. The thief may act, and will be watching." Harrow agreed, his eyes gleaming with hope, and Beatrice promised to keep the plan secret. The announcement was made at lunch, Harrow's voice carrying a mix of gravitas and excitement. "I've discovered something," he said, pausing for effect. "A clue that may lead us to the Stradivarius. I'll share it tonight after dinner." The guests reacted subtly. Clara's eyes widened, Quill's pen froze. Felix's smile tightened, and Sophia's expression remained impassive. Miss Marple watched them all, her knitting needles still, her senses alert. She spent the afternoon preparing, enlisting James, the chauffeur, to watch the hidden passage's entrance in the pantry. She examined the music room again, noting the bookshelf's position and the case's lock. The manuscript's theft had given her a new angle. Perhaps the thief was targeting items for a specific buyer, or perhaps the manuscript was a decoy. She spoke with Beatrice, who confirmed that Felix had been asking about the manuscript's value, a detail that sharpened her focus on him. As evening approached, Miss Marple dressed in a dark blue dress, her appearance unassuming but her mind razor sharp. Dinner was a tense affair, the guests exchanging strained pleasantries. Lord Harrow played his part well, dropping hints about the clue without revealing too much. Miss Marple watched the guests' reactions, noting Felix's sudden departure to fetch a cigar. Excusing herself, she followed him, her steps silent on the carpeted corridors. She caught him at the entrance to the hidden passage, his hand on the panel. "Mr. Durant," she said, her voice calm but firm. Felix froze, then turned, his smile forced. "Miss Marple." "Just exploring, you know how it is." But his coat pocket bulged, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Might I see what you're carrying?" she asked. Felix hesitated, then pulled out the Monteverdi manuscript, his face crumpling. "I didn't take the violin," he said. "This was just an opportunity." Miss Marple led him back to the music room, where the other guests had gathered. Felix confessed to stealing the manuscript, admitting he'd planned to sell it. To a collector. I used the passage to get to the study, he said. The key was in the desk, easy enough. But he swore he hadn't touched the Stradivarius, and Miss Marple believed him. His theft was opportunistic, not planned, and the violin's disappearance required more finesse. The trap had worked, but not as she'd hoped. The violin's thief remained at large, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the remaining suspects. Quill's obsession and Sophia's motives were still in play, but the locked case loomed large. As she retired to her room, her knitting resumed, her thoughts racing. The net was tightening, but the final piece was still out of reach. Chapter 13, The Confrontation, the 9th day at Harrow Manor, was a turning point. The air thick with the promise of resolution. Miss Marple, dressed in a soft gray dress, spent the morning reviewing her clues, the hidden passage, the locked case, the manuscript's theft, and the tiny splinter she'd found near the passage. Felix's confession had cleared one suspect, but the Stradivarius's thief was still among them, and she was determined to unmask them. She began by re-examining the music room, focusing on the glass case. The splinter suggested the thief had tampered with it, perhaps prying it open or using a tool to bypass the lock. She spoke with Lord Harrow, asking about the case's construction. Solid as a vault, he said. The locksmith swore it was impregnable, but Miss Marple knew that no lock was truly impregnable, only resistant, and she asked to see the key again. Noting its unique ridge as dot, her suspicions had crystallized around Dr. Quill, whose obsession with the Stradivarius and knowledge of the manor made him a prime candidate. She sought him out in the library, finding him hunched over his notebook, his face drawn. "Dr. Quill," she said, settling opposite him, "I've been thinking about the violin's history. You know so much about it, perhaps too much." Quill's eyes widened, but he forced a laugh. "I'm a scholar, Miss Marple. Knowledge isn't a crime." Miss Marple smiled, her tone gentle but relentless. "I found a splinter near the hidden passage," she said. "From the violin's case, I believe. And I noticed a similar splinter in your coat pocket yesterday." Quill's face paled and his hands trembled. "You're mistaken," he said, but his voice cracked. Miss Marple pressed on, describing the passage's footprints and his late-night movements, piecing together a narrative he couldn't refute. Finally, Quill broke, his shoulders slumping. "I took it," he whispered, "not to sell, but to protect it. Lord Harrow doesn't understand its value. He'd let anyone play it, ruin it." He admitted to using the passage to enter the music room, prying open the case with a small tool, and hiding the violin in a secret compartment in his room. "I was going to return it," he said, his voice desperate. "I swear." Miss Marple listened, her expression calm, but her mind triumphant. She persuaded Quill to show her the violin, which was indeed hidden in a false panel behind his wardrobe. The Stradivarius was unharmed, its varnish gleaming. She summoned Lord Harrow and Beatrice, who were overjoyed but shaken. "You're a marvel, Jane," Beatrice said, tears in her eyes. Quill was confined to his room, awaiting the authorities. His scholarly dreams shattered as the household absorbed the news. Miss Marple reflected on the case. Quill's obsession had driven him to theft, but his motive was preservation, not profit, a twist that reminded her of the complexities of human nature. She joined the guests for tea, noting Clara's relief, Sophia's indifference, and Felix's chastened silence. The mystery was solved, but one task remained to ensure. Justice was served with compassion. Chapter 14. The true culprit. Dr. Quill's confession had resolved the violin's theft. Miss Marple felt a lingering unease as the 10th day dawned. The case had been too neatly tied, and her instincts, honed by years of unraveling village intrigues, told her there was more to uncover. She dressed in a soft lavender dress, her pearl brooch a quiet nod to her resolve, and set out to tie up the loose ends. She began by revisiting Quill's confession, replaying his words in her mind. His motive protecting the Stradivarius was plausible, but his method bothered her. Prying open the case seemed crude for a man of his precision, and the splinter in his pocket felt almost too convenient. She returned to the music room, examining the case again, and noticed a tiny scratch near the lock, barely visible. It suggested a more sophisticated tool, perhaps a lockpick, which Quill hadn't mentioned. Miss Marple sought out Clara. Finding her in the conservatory, her face brighter now that the violin was recovered. "You must be relieved, Miss Marple," said, settling beside her. Clara nodded, but her eyes were wary. Miss Marple asked about Quill's behavior during the performance, and Clara hesitated, then admitted to seeing him near the case afterward, adjusting something. It was a small detail, but it fueled Miss Marple's doubts. She spoke with Beatrice next, asking about Quill's invitation. "Charles met him at a lecture," Beatrice said. "He was so knowledgeable, we thought he'd be perfect for the unveiling." But Beatrice mentioned an odd detail Quill had asked about the manor's security before arriving. A question that now seemed suspicious. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the possibility of a larger scheme. She confronted Quill again, finding him in his room, his face haggard. "Dr. Quill," she said, her voice firm, "I believe you're protecting someone. The case's lock wasn't pried, it was picked with skill you don't possess." Quill's eyes widened, but he shook his head. "I told you everything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple pressed, mentioning the scratch and Clara's observation, and Quill's resolve crumbled. "It was Sophia," he whispered. "She planned it. She knew I wanted the violin safe, so she offered to help, said she'd get it out of the case if I hid it. I didn't know she meant to sell it." Miss Marple listened, her heart sinking but not surprised. Sophia's resentment and financial troubles made her a likely mastermind, and her knowledge of the manor's passages sealed it. Miss Marple summoned Sophia, confronting her in the library with Quill's testimony. Sophia's face was a mask of calm, but her eyes betrayed her. "You've no proof," she said, but Miss Marple laid out the evidence: the button near the passage, her argument with Felix, her late-night presence in the pantry. Sophia's mask cracked, and she admitted to orchestrating the theft, planning to sell the violin to fund her investments. "Quill was a fool," she said. "He thought he was saving it." Miss Marple informed Lord Harrow and Beatrice, who were stunned. Sophia was confined to her room, and the authorities were called. The violin, already recovered, was returned to its case, and Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. The true culprit had been unmasked, and the manor's peace, however fragile, was restored. Chapter 15. Resolution. The final day at Harrow Manor was bittersweet, the sun breaking through the clouds as if to signal the end of the storm. Miss Marple, dressed in her bust gray dress, joined the household for breakfast, her knitting bag at her side. The atmosphere was subdued, the thefts and betrayals weighing heavily, but there was also relief. The Stradivarius was safe, and justice was in motion. Lord Harrow, his spirits partially restored, thanked Miss Marple profusely. "You've saved us, Miss Marple," he said, his voice thick. "I don't know how you did it," Beatrice echoed his gratitude, her eyes warm with affection. "You're welcome back any time, Jane." Miss Marple smiled, deflecting their praise with her usual modesty, but her heart was glad. Clara Wren, cleared of suspicion, approached Miss Marple after breakfast, her face radiant. "I'm to play again tonight," she said. "A small concert to heal the wounds?" Miss Marple nodded, encouraging her to seize the moment. Felix Durand, chastened by his own confession, apologized quietly, promising to make amends. Miss Marple listened, her expression kind but firm, knowing his path would be his own to walk. Sophia and Dr. Quill faced the consequences of their actions. The authorities arrived, discreetly escorted by Mr. Grayson, and both were taken for questioning. Miss Marple spoke briefly with the inspector, outlining the evidence with her usual clarity. She felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness for the choices that had led to such ruin. The evening's concert was a triumph, Clara's music filling the music room with hope. The Stradivarius sang under her bow, its notes a reminder of beauty's resilience. Miss Marple sat in the back, her knitting idle, her eyes on the guests. Beatrice and Harrow held hands, their bond strengthened by the ordeal. Clara's face glowed with purpose, and even Felix seemed moved. His cynicism softened as the music ended. Miss Marple slipped away, her work done. She packed her suitcase, her movements unhurried, and arranged for James to drive her to the station the next morning. In her room, she sat by the window, her knitting needles clicking softly, her mind reflecting on the case. It had been a puzzle of locks and passages, of obsession and betrayal, but at its heart, it was a story of human frailty. She had solved it, not with brilliance, but with patience, observation, and uncheckable belief in truth, the train to St. Mary Mead awaited, and with it, the quiet of her cottage, her roses, and her knitting. But Miss Marple knew that other mysteries would find her, as they always did. For now, she was content, the Stradivarius's song echoing in her heart as she prepared for home.